let's talk about life after death. At this point, if you've watched my previous videos, you have a good sense of how I kind of view the self and how I view both duality and non-duality. And you've been introduced to the concept of the Great Cycle. And I want to start this video by saying that life and death are a cycle. Everything created by the mind is also cyclical. Life and death is no different, in my opinion. And therefore, I believe that life and death are a cycle. I don't believe that death is permanent. But that also does not necessarily mean that we live forever. And I'll explain what that means in a moment. But for right now, I just want to say that all dual experiences end in non-dual nothingness, which is selflessness, right? So we have no self to begin with when we are in that state of nothingness, when we are in that non-dualistic state. So if we look at the fundamental equation, right? When we are in the non-dualistic state, where everything is one, everything is whole, there's no way to differentiate between the parts. The experience of nothingness from the perspective of the one observer, that is where we begin and that is where we end. And that is specifically what makes it a cycle, is the fact that we begin and end at the same point. So let's think of a dream to try to understand what it might be like to go through one phase or one rotation of the cycle of life and death. And we'll use the dream analogy, which is one of my favorite analogies. When we dream, we are moving from our normal waking life down into the dream world, right? I think it's not controversial to say that we are going within ourself, right? And so if you think about going within yourself is an act of going lower or deeper, right? So you can think of being going down layers into yourself. And so we go into the dream world and we have a dream self and we experience that dream self. Oftentimes we experience that dream self as if it is the only self we have ever experienced or will ever experience. It's in some ways feels disconnected unless you're lucid dreaming or unless your character within the dream has some kind of context about your waking self. Generally speaking, most dreams, the dream character or the dream self is isolated from the waking self. So we experience our dream, and then when we wake up, we ascend back to normal waking life, right? So you can see there's a clear flow where as we go inward, like if you think of like a fractal, right? If you've never seen a fractal zoom, I highly recommend it. There's plenty of them available at this point. But any fractal will do, like the Mandelbrot set. If you zoom in, you create more separation, right? So zooming in is dualistic. So increase duality, right? As we zoom out, we unify, okay? So decrease duality, so non-dual, right? So if you think of the fractal, the more you zoom in, the more complex it gets, right? It's layers upon layers of infinite amounts of these little shapes that are just recurring. And that's what I'm saying right now, that the mind is. This whole thing has been talking about the idea of the mind as a type of self-observing fractal, which generates more minds by interacting with itself, okay? But if you zoom out of the fractal, you eventually get to a point to where you see this one sort of shape, right? And the shape isn't surrounded by other shapes, it's just surrounded by sort of nothingness. And if we go back to my previous videos, you'll remember that I talked about how the original state of reality is a self-observing mind that is both filled with and surrounded by nothingness, just like that Mandelbrot fractal when you zoom out. So again, zooming in, we increase duality. Zooming out, we decrease duality until we reach a point of non-duality where there's only one thing filled with and surrounded by nothingness. So how does this relate to a dream? Well, if we descend into ourself, we create another fractal self, right? A dream self. And when we ascend, we unify the entire dream world, all the characters, including our dream self and our dream friends, our dream pet, the dream world. It all comes back into one mind, one you, one self. There's only one, right? So all the little separate pieces inside the dream become one piece as we ascend back into waking life. So if death is ascension in the sense that we are waking up from this world, right? If you think of what happens when you die in a dream, you wake up. You don't go deeper into another dream, at least as far as we can tell. There's no way to really prove that. But as far as we can tell, you wake up back into the waking life, which means you're ascending when you wake. Dreaming is descending. So if we die in the waking world, we would be ascending into the world above it. So what would happen? We would unify into what is essentially whatever mind is dreaming this entire world. So in other words, you and I, while we appear to be separate or dualistic in this world, we are one dreamer dreaming all the different characters and aspects of this world. And so when we die, we wake up into that. Now, as far as what that looks like, it depends. Because there are these layers, right? And there are three basic layers. I should have left the dual and non-dual, but that's okay. There are three basic layers: above, below, and between, right? And again, you can think of these as everything comes back to the same simple patterns, right? The same simple patterns and represented in everything because, again, everything is mind. So the nature of mind is going to be found in everything. So the more we reduce reality, the more clearly we see what mind really is. All right. So in terms of what that looks like, well, it depends on what layer of reality you're at, because there are essentially an infinite number of layers of reality. But despite them being infinite, they always eventually come back to nothingness, right? So they always, through the great cycle, everything begins and ends at that state of nothingness. And I like to use entropy as an example of this. Entropy is basically the concept that everything decays back to a state of everything being equal and non-differentiated from each other, right? So if you think of it, basically everything on the right side of the equation eventually becomes the left side of the equation. So a good example of that would be like if you have a mountain, right? And you have a pit, I guess we'll call it. You have a mountain and a pit. This is differentiation, right? This is high. This is low, okay? And this would be like the neutral plane, ground level, or whatever you want to call it. Now, over time, if nothing actively attempts to prevent it, this will erode, and this ground will slowly, or this mountain will slowly erode, and its dirt will erode outward, and eventually this will be filled up with dirt, and it will be shifted all around until it's all equal again. It's all neutral, right? So that's kind of a basic example of how entropy works, at least within my conception of it. And the basic idea here is that all dualistic, I'm going to write this because I think it's important, all dualistic forms decay into non-duality, okay? And so again, what do we mean by that? Well, the idea of decaying simply means that over time, everything kind of loses energy to its environment, to each other. Everything sort of blends together over time. That's really what decaying is that a single form cannot maintain itself eternally. Energy is never locked in anything. The energy will always escape over time, which means that as energy escapes, eventually, over a long enough period of time, even an infinite timeline, that energy will equal itself out. It will even itself out, just like the mountain eroded, right? It will all decay into basically a soup. And what is a soup? Well, it's undifferentiated. A pure, undifferentiated soup would be the same thing as nothingness. So we go back to the great cycle, right? So that's what life and death is this kind of decay of dualistic forms into non-dualistic formlessness. So something into nothing. So how does this fit into this three-layer model? Well, let's say, for example, that there are 100 layers, right? And there can be any number of layers. I'm just picking 100 just for the sake of it. But there can be any number of layers. So the very top layer, the most above, right? The highest above, the transcendent above, will be nothingness, right? So at the very top will be nothingness. And I probably won't go into this, but the deepest layer also infinitely would eventually be nothingness. So we have a nothing sandwich here. That's what reality is a big nothing sandwich. So if there are 100 layers, then the question becomes, which layer are we on presently, right? Because think of it this way. Let's say, for example, that the layer above us is nothingness, right? So if we die, we return to nothingness directly. There's nothing in between the waking world and nothingness. Okay, let's erase these to avoid confusion for now. So if this was the case, and this is our dream, right? Let's say these are the only 3 layers, then my model would predict that when you die, you will ascend to nothingness, and in that ascension, you will eventually be spit back out of nothingness over an unknown timeline, because there's no time in the state of nothingness. We talked about that in the previous video, time and timelessness. There's no time in a state of nothingness because there's no observable change. But at some point, change will occur because there's always, the observer is always observing, right? So there's always the potential for change. It's just whether or not it's going to be observed, be there to be observed. So eventually, that state of nothingness will spit out something that is observable, and that will create a new dualistic waking world. And then from that new dualistic waking world, you may descend into any number of other worlds, just like a fractal, right? But let's say, for example, that we've already descended into hundreds of layers below the layer of nothingness, the layer of oneness. Well, in that case, this would essentially be a dream, right? So this would be a dream, and when we're dreaming from one dream into another dream, just like a fractal zoom, right? Into another dream. And I do want to say that I don't necessarily mean literally dreaming. I think dreaming is a very apt metaphor because it is consciousness creating a world. But I'm not saying it's the exact same thing as a dream, because we have brains, and brains are complex, and a lot of the things that we experience wouldn't be experienceable without sensory functions and all of this. So I don't want to get into explaining whether or not this is exactly the same thing as a dream, but it's close enough, right? For the sake of what we're saying. So we're going to call it a dream for now. So let's say this world is a dream, and we're dreaming into another dream when we go to sleep, and then there we dream into another sleep. And really what this is saying the size of the cycle, right? The great cycle. So let's say, for example, the first dream is a gear like this big, right? And this gear, when we dream into it, is going into a smaller gear inside of itself. We can think of it like this as well, right? It's going inside of itself into a smaller cycle, right? So this cycle will end before this cycle ends. So that's why you wake up before you die, right? Because a dream is shorter than your entire life, even though a dream can appear to be an entire life. So the dream life is a shorter cycle than the waking life. So again, if you think about it, descending, we're getting more inward, right? And so we're getting smaller and smaller the frequency is increasing and the wavelength is shortening, would be another way to think about that. But let's not get too much into that. So every layer we go deeper, we're getting smaller and smaller, right? We're zooming in further and further into that fractal. So every time we die or the dream ends or we wake up, we're going to go into the layer outside of that layer, the layer that contains it. So if we're 100 layers away from nothingness, then we're going to wake up into another dream. We're going to wake up into another dualistic reality. So I cannot predict what will happen when we die because I cannot measure or predict what layer we are on. All I can predict within my model is that it is a great cycle and that the beginning and the end of the cycle, the highest and lowest possible layer, are both nothingness. So all I can really tell you will happen is that eventually your chain of forms, right? And by that I mean the characters that you're playing in these dreams essentially. Your chain of forms, the sequence of forms, will eventually decay into a non-form, into a formlessness, right? A formless experience, which is a non-self, a state of nothing. I can't tell you when that's going to happen because I can't tell you what layer we're on. Now, the New Age movement and all that can talk about, we're in the third dimension, we're moving into the fourth dimension and all that stuff. Maybe. I can't honestly tell you if that's true or not. I don't think they can tell you if it's true or not either. And I don't think that they know for sure if they can trust their sources, if their sources are telling them that. But all we know, or all I believe I know, I shouldn't say I even know it, but all I believe I know is this model of the great cycle and these essential layers. For every layer you're on, there's a layer above and a layer below. The one exception being that the layers disappear essentially when you are in a state of nothingness and you would be in the highest layer and the only direction you could really theoretically go in is below. But because of the way it works, once you go inside yourself, if you look outside, then it appears as though you are outside yourself, right? So in other words, by traveling inside yourself, you can create the illusion that you've actually gone outside yourself. And once again, we'll use the dream analogy for that, where I guess I should have kept the circle. If this is the waking world, right, outside of yourself, so this is like, the world you see around you right now while listening to this video. This is my voice, this is your desk, everything outside the circle. The circle is you, the circle is yourself. When you dream, you descend into yourself, right? And you descend into a character inside your dream. But what's outside the character? A new world, right? So even though you go inside yourself, as you go inside yourself, you create an external world from your previous internal world. There's all sorts of psychological implications for that, but we're not going to get into it, unfortunately, right now. Maybe a future video. But the point is basically that by going inside of yourself, you can still create the illusion that you're moving outside of yourself. So it's all relative, and all that matters is that once you get to the layer where you are at pure nothingness, that's the most fundamental layer that you can be at of reality. And then from that, you will descend or ascend, whatever you want to call it. I would technically say that we're descending, but it doesn't really matter, the technicalities, into a dualistic state. So let's see if I've covered everything. Oh, I did want to explain, when we die, I want you to understand that it is the character that is dying, it is not you, okay? Remember, forms, dualistic forms are what decay. The observer never decays, never decays. The observer is eternal, immortal. So the real you, the observer, according to me, according to my model, will never ever die, will never ever decay. It is only the form that the observer observes that will decay. Okay? So in terms of what I mean by that, like let's use the dream analogy, right? The character within your dream dies, but you don't die, you just wake up, right? So your mind still exists. Your mind always exists. But as we've talked about previously, the character is not the same thing as the mind, even though it identifies as that character. So the mind identifies as the character, but it is not technically the character, except for the point of view that it's playing, right? It believes that it's the character and experiences reality as the character. So in that sense, it is the character. However, when the character dies, the mind doesn't disappear. It doesn't die. But the way that the character, as a sort of cup or container, shaped the mind, that does die. That ego, that self, that concept of what you are, your history and all that does die. In the same way that when I read one book and I'm experiencing it as the character Remy, the main character of that book, when that book ends, that would be like the equivalent of death, right? Whether the character dies or not. When the book ends, there's no more Remy to read about, right? Maybe there's a sequel, I don't know. But for the sake of this, there's no more Remy to talk about. There's no more Remy to experience or learn about. So that is the death. That is the end of Remy. But it's not the end of you, the reader. So you can't, you're no longer going to interpret reality through the lens of Remy because you're no longer reading Remy's story. If you go on to read a different story, like Yara's story or Milo's story, then now you're experiencing a new character. And that's what I'm saying. That's all that death is the end of a character, but that's still important. I'm not saying it's insignificant because memories and everything we think we know about ourselves can be tied to that character. So just like when you're in a dream, you think, oh, I'm this dream character with this, dream realities are so weird. They don't seem weird to us at the time. That's because relevance, right? That's how POV works. Everything seems normal according to your own POV. But the point I'm making is that when we're experiencing a dream, we think that that dream self is our real self, and we think whatever history the dream self believes in, like maybe you had a different family, maybe you grew up in a different country and not inside the dream, maybe you're an alien or an extraterrestrial, whatever word you want to use, inside the dream, right? But then when you wake up, is that story still true? Well, it doesn't stop being true for the character in the dream, but is it true for you, the waking character that you're playing now? Not really, no. So you can see how this gets complicated in terms of weaving the stories together and really trying to understand who or what are you. And the best I can ever say is that you are never the form, but you can identify with the form because identifying with the form allows you to temporarily experience that point of view, right? And so I have this diagram over here, and I kind of wanted to use the analogy of zooming into a physical body. So let's say, for example, we would say if this is us, right? If this circle represents us, we are here, right? We are at the center. This circle is us, and we are at the center. This sphere, whatever you want to call it. So what happens if we zoom in to the very, very point at the center and make it bigger? Well, then it's going to look just like this circle again, right? It's going to look big. Well, if we're talking about everything made up of something else, right? Like if you think of the fractal, if you zoom in, there's lots of little fractals. Then if you zoom in on one of those little fractals, there's lots of little fractals. Or if you think about this in a physics point of view, you've got a cell, and then you zoom into the cell, right? And what's the cell made of? It's made of atoms. And you zoom into the atoms. What are the atoms made of? They're made of particles. Right? What are the particles made of? They're made of like quarks and things like that. What are the quarks made of? Maybe they're made of strings. We don't freaking know. So the point is that you can zoom in potentially forever. I mean, maybe if you argue that the Planck length limits the form that can be visible, but that's not the point I'm trying to make. I'm not trying to make this so technical. It's being used as an analogy. So the analogy and what I'm trying to demonstrate with it is that if you try to say like, okay, well, I'm this thing at the very center. Something at the center is really me. Something at the center of my being. But if you zoom in, that center gets bigger, right? The closer you get to it, the bigger it gets. And the more you can differentiate it. Well, are you the left side of the center or the right side? Because the closer you get, the bigger it gets, and the more you can divide it and individuate it and say, well, which part of this is really you? Because if I took one part of it out, right? Like just if we think of our body, if we take a part of our body apart, or if we take a cell out of our body, that doesn't mean we stop being us, right? So if we zoom in to this self, whether it's physical or conceptual, if we zoom into this self, well, which part is us? Which part of the self is us? And that's why I always preach or say that within my model, all forms are conceptual forms. There is really no thing as a true physical form because there really is nothing but the mind. So it's all rendering. If you're familiar with the concept of rendering, it's like a computer term, right? So if you think of the pixels on your computer screen, they're used to render the image that you're watching in this video right now. Okay, so it's the same thing is true. If you take like a computer character, right? If we have a computer character and we zoom into our computer character, what's the computer character made of? Well, when we were looking at it from a distance, it looked like a person, right? They had hands and a face and all this great stuff. But if we zoom in, what's it going to look like? Well, depending on the quality of the graphics, it would be the same as zooming in on a person. We're going to see cells and tissue, and then you're going to zoom in further and see atoms, and just like we talked about. Or you're going to see like colors, right? You're going to see like pixels, like boxes. And you can keep zooming in and zooming in and zooming in. And the point is that all that matters is that it's what's rendered. The form is what's rendered. So the form is whatever like pixels or atoms or quarks or strings, it doesn't matter. Whatever you're working with at a smaller layer, if you zoom out, you can make that look like an object. Zoom out being coming back to this model, right? There's always an above or a below unless you're at the void, the nothingness. Then there's no above and below until you create duality. But as long as you can zoom out and zoom in, you can create the illusion of objects. But objects are always conceptual. So there is no actual you. You can never find you. There's not a single neuron. Yes, I'm making this claim. Yes, this is a scientific claim. There's not a single neuron that's you. I believe that will be proven. There's not a single cell that's you. I believe that will be proven. There's not a single network of electrical variance or valence that's you. There is no you that can be found anywhere in the universe because you are the observer. So where is the observer? Well, it's not anywhere in what it's observing, right? It is the observer. You can't find the observer in what it's observing. It's like, to use a weird analogy, it's like trying to escape a dream from within the dream. It's like saying, well, if I find the right door in the dream, I'll be able to escape the dream, right? Like, what if I climb this hill? Is the way to exit the dream at the top of the hill? No, the way to exit the dream is nowhere in the dream. Because the dream, the entire world of the dream, is a conceptual rendering of something in your mind. The only way to escape the dream is to be the dream, right? To realize that the dream itself is an expansion of your mind. It's just like we talk about the void, right? Expanding and contracting into manifestations, into different realities, right? Dualistic realities. That's all reality is. That's all the dream is a dualistic version of your whole. So in the case of a dream, your whole is your mind, right? Your mind is the whole. And when you want to escape the dream, you have to once again become your whole mind. So where is your mind in the dream? That's the question we're asking. We say, what am I? Who am I? Where's my true self? Is it somewhere in the brain? Is it in my hands? Is it in my spinal cord? Is it electrical signals? Is it the way data is processed? No, it's none of those things. There is no you except for the observer. And the observer is not an object. It is, as we defined before, it is what objects exist within, right? It is the thing which information is generated by and interacts with. So I guess to sum it up, what do I believe? I believe that life is an eternal journey, and it is an infinite journey where we continuously are born and die. We take different forms, and those forms eventually decay back into formlessness. And there are many, many potential layers, and we don't know what layer we are on, so we don't know exactly what's going to happen after we die. All I can really say is that eventually we will die and we will become the void. I don't know if it'll be after this death or the next death. Some people find comfort in this. Some people find comfort in knowing that eventually we will just rejoin the whole, rejoin the one mind. Some people find that scary. They feel like, well, what does it mean to become one with God, or whatever you want to call it? Does that mean that I lose my identity? Well, in a sense, what is it like waking up from a dream, right? Are you scared to wake up from your dream? Is that a terrifying experience? Is it something you should be worried about? No. That character died and you became you, but you never stopped being you. You never really lost your identity. You just kind of took on a new one. And so God would be your new identity. It would be like waking up and realizing that you were God. And I'm not saying, that you will wake up if you die and immediately become God. I don't know. Just like when we wake up from a dream, we don't immediately become God, right? I'm not God in this world. and I'm guessing you aren't either. So you could wake up into just another world that's different. It could be worse, it could be better. I don't know. I assume within my model that we will all eventually experience every possibility because we have an infinite timeline to do so. So we eventually experience infinite possibilities. What do I not claim to know, right? I don't want to claim to know exactly what layer of reality we're on. I don't want to claim to know exactly what you'll experience when you die. I don't want to encourage anyone to die. I don't want to discourage anyone from, I don't want you to fear death. I don't think death needs to be feared. And you don't know what you're going to wake up into until you're awake again. You realize, oh yeah, this was my life. I remember it now. But you didn't remember it when you were inside the dream. So you don't know what you're going to wake up into. And I can't tell you what you're going to wake up into. So we'll all find out when we get there. And I don't think any of us should be in a rush because, like I said, it's, at least according to my model, an eternal process. So we'll get there in time. All right, I think I've got one more video in me before I call it quits and look for feedback. So I'll see you next time, and hopefully this wasn't too long.